Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Kirsch. I'm a student at MiraCosta College studying sociology. Before I start this presentation, I want to tell you a story about myself. My grandmother passed away several years ago, and I remember going to the funeral home to attend her service. It was dark and kind of eerie, and I remember my mom didn't want to see her mother's body at the viewing. My aunt had told us that the makeup the mortician had placed on my grandmother had made her unrecognizable. At the time, I remember thinking, why wasn't my grandmother's body good enough to see the way it was? Over the years, I've talked with others who have had similar experiences, so I started doing some research. I wanted to know why American culture is so distant from their dead and how we've come to rely on businesses to conduct the death care of our loved ones. Through my research, I've come to understand that the state of our current funerary practices are to blame. I'm presenting the argument that this $200 billion industry is flawed, working to shield us from healthy engagement with the dead. And these industry led interactions not only leave us with little meaningful family involvement and a culture of fear surrounding corpses, but a financial burden that most families cannot bear. What started as a seemingly morbid fascination transformed into a research project I presented for a course last spring. And today, I will focus on the negative consequences of our current funerary model and new options emerging in death care called the Green Death Movement. But first, a little bit of background. How did we get here? Well, 200 years ago, dying a good death was a universally shared concept that was integral to life, which played out at home. The women of the home were responsible for washing and dressing the body, and when the funeral was over, the body was placed in a shroud and buried in a cemetery or right on the family plot. However, two things happened during and after the Civil War that would change the way Americans practiced death care. When the Civil War hit, families had to contend with the fact that their loved ones were dying far from home. So some wealthy Northern families were willing to pay to have their bodies returned home to them. But before the invention of refrigeration and the heat and humidity would happen, it would cause the body to decompose in a matter of a couple of days. So, chemical corpse preservation using arsenic, or the practice of embalming, was introduced to transport soldiers' bodies home so that their loved ones could say goodbye. This initial embalming boom crescendoed after the Civil War when President Abraham Lincoln's body was preserved and then paraded on a train back to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. Nothing like this had ever happened to any president and hasn't since. And this was the first time Americans saw an embalmed body and were mesmerized. So these non professionals in makeshift tents setting up next to battlefields started gaining practice with civilians who could afford it and eventually gained public acceptance for their craft. Death became a specialized profession solely for men, one that employed the science of embalming, which was a service that separated their duties that had previously fallen to women who were removed from the process. Once the public was convinced that embalming was necessary and undertakers should care for the dead, death became profitable and elaborate accessories like headstones and caskets and hearses started showing up. As a result, the cost of burying the dead rose fast and continues to rise. So, fast forward to today. A traditional burial in the United States consists of a body being embalmed with formaldehyde, which is then placed in a wooden or metal casket lined with an airtight rubber seal. Then, this is placed in a concrete vault in the ground at the cemetery. According to the National Funeral Directors Association, the national median cost for a funeral with a viewing and burial for 2019 was $7,640. If a vault is included, something that is typically required by a cemetery, the median cost is a little over $9,000. The cost does not take into account funerary home expenses or miscellaneous charges like flowers or an obituary. And the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers recorded a 227.1% increase for funeral expenses from 1986 to 2017, which is almost double the price increase of all other consumer goods. As a result, funerals have become a luxury many families cannot afford. Now, embalming is not required by law. However, most funeral homes will not allow a public visitation unless the body is embalmed. And because they're private businesses, they're allowed to do this. But mourners not knowing their rights as consumers is a cause for concern. Plus, these decisions are hurting the planet. More than 800,000 gallons of this toxic cocktail is buried annually. In your typical cemetery, embalmed bodies are placed in caskets, like I mentioned, using 20 million board feet of hardwood and over 64,000 tons of steel. And over 2 million tons of concrete are used each year to produce cemetery vaults. Cemeteries here in the United States, as well as all over the world, are reaching capacity. So we're now seeing cremation rates are rising fast. According to the National Funeral Directors Association, in 2010, 40% of deaths resulted in cremation as the choice for final disposition. And it predicts that by 2040, cremation will account for over 78% of dispositions in the United States. Now, there are several reasons for this increase. Namely, cremation requires fewer services and materials, so it's significantly less expensive than a traditional funeral. A direct cremation, that is one without embalming or visitation, can cost between $1,000 to $2,200. And the environmental concerns, including land use and avoidance of chemicals released into the ground, have raised an interest in cremation. However, one cremation consumes as much energy as a 500-mile car ride. Cremations in the United States pump 600 million pounds of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere annually. So is it the eco way to go? Not exactly, but there are other options, like alkaline hydrolysis, sometimes called aquamation or water cremation. This is the process through which a body is placed in a pressurized steel container with water and alkali heated at 350 degrees to accelerate the natural decomposition of a corpse, reducing it to soft bone fragments. After the process, the liquid is an inert, neutralized mixture of amino acids, peptides, sugars, and salts, which can be repurposed as fertilizer or safely flushed into the sewage system. The bone fragments are then pulverized and returned to the dead person's loved ones. According to the Funeral Consumers Alliance, when compared to flame cremation, alkaline hydrolysis uses 1/8 of the energy and leaves less than 1/4 of the carbon footprint. And since corpses and materials aren't being incinerated between 1600 and 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, there's a drastic reduction in greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide emissions. And in 2017, California was added to the list of now 20 states that have legalized alkaline hydrolysis for humans. But in recent years, it's become popular to want to become a tree after you die or help nourish a tree after you die. And companies like BioSearn are popping up, selling the idea of sustainability while still asking for cremated remains to be mixed with soil and seeds. However, ashes are inorganic bone fragments and can form a thick, chalky layer. And unless distributed into the soil just right, it can actually hurt or kill the tree. What it seems like these consumers really want are ways to transform their organic matter into something beneficial for the environment. Farmers have been practicing something called livestock mortality composting for decades now. This is the process of taking an animal which is high in nitrogen, covering it in a composting material that's high in carbon, like wood chips, and letting breezes provide oxygen and rain provide moisture. And in about 9 months, all that remains is nutrient-rich compost. The cow is completely transformed. So, can this be done with humans? Well, in May of last year, Washington State became the first state to legalize human composting. A public benefit corporation called Recompose has opened its first facility this year in Seattle, where bodies are placed in a receptacle along with organic material like wood chips and straw to help speed up the natural transition from human remains into soil. The recompose process takes about 30 days, and the soil is then returned to families who can use it to grow trees or nourish gardens. And the whole process costs $5,500 for everything: the body pickup, the paperwork, the process itself, and an optional service. And similar legislation in states such as Colorado, California, and Oregon are already in the works. But maybe the simplest alternative in death care is natural burial. No casket, no embalming, just a body in the dirt and letting nature take its course with little to no environmental impact. Natural burial has remained an integral part of religious and cultural practices for many whose history and culture has historically been marginalized. Now, this practice is legal in all 50 states. However, cemeteries are allowed to set their individual policies. The problem is that some mourners are made to believe that buying a casket or a vault is the law when it is not. There is also conservation burial grounds. Through a conservation easement, which is a legal agreement between a land trust or government agency that limits the use of land in order to protect it, once you bury bodies into that land, it cannot be developed or artificially altered. Only indigenous plants and trees are planted there, and both natural burial and conservation burial range between $1,000 to $4,000 for everything. So the funeral industry is negatively impacting not only the planet, but families. We turn our dead over to these businesses with potentially no knowledge of the many options we have, as well as little awareness of our rights as consumers. Death is a scary subject, but it's in all of our futures. And with more awareness and access to different death care options, we could make an environmental and cultural impact. Thank you so much for watching my presentation, and I'm now happy to answer any questions.